Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. We're going to be talking about the legal issues affecting boards in 2021. And joining me is Katie Martin, who's a partner and board chair for Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you, TK. It's nice to be here.
So, yes, legal issues. It doesn't seem like we can talk about legal issues, or for that matter, any boardroom issues, without addressing what I call the elephants in the room coming into 2021. And that would be particularly those issues coming out of 2020, like diversity, like ESG, like human capital management. Those are just a few of the bigger issues coming out that boards are going to have to deal with, particularly with the sensitivity of investors and the social sensitivity. So, sort of, what are the legal implications around those three?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, TK. I would agree with you. I think those are going to be some of the key legal issues that boards are going to have to deal with this year. There's no doubt about it. Starting with diversity, I think it's important to note that California, as you know, adopted a law a couple of years ago, actually, when Jerry Brown was still the governor, and in 2018, that mandated that women go on boards of, so any company that's headquartered in California, starting in 2019, had to have at least one female director if they were a public company. And this is going to be an important year because 2021 is the year where the second piece of that law is going to take effect. And for boards of size of 6 or more, they'll be required to have three women directors. And so, this obviously we've seen a significant change relative to the number of women who are serving on boards. I think I heard some data the other day that indicated in the S&P 500 that there might be 90+% of those boards now have at least 2 women. So I think it's great. I think there's been a lot of change generated by that particular law. And in 2020, California actually adopted another law. It was, I think, on the 2-year anniversary of the first law. And this one, Gavin Newsom approved. And this one is actually going to mandate underrepresented minorities on boards. And the first year that will be phased in for that will be this year. So public companies, at least those that are headquartered in California, will be really focused, I think, on board composition this year, and trying to decide what's the right size for the board, what are the right skills for the board, and of course, the most important thing I think they're going to be focused on is diversity, given these mandates. There's a lot of literature out there, as you know, that lends itself to favoring diversity, and it's part of the reason that shareholders are so supportive. That there is a correlation, I think a proven correlation between diversity and the way a company performs. So it's not surprising that that these laws have really, I think, increased or accelerated at least the change at the board level. Shareholders, of course, are still hoping to see more in terms of at the C-suite and executive level. And of course, they're really looking to see a lot more disclosure on these issues as well. And in that regard, I should just note that NASDAQ, one of the 2 main stock exchanges, implemented it or proposed a rule. Actually, it has not been adopted, but they proposed a rule in December about diversity. And this particular rule is a little different than the ones that California implemented. They're proposing that boards would have at least one woman and at least one underrepresented minority, or alternatively, a board or company could disclose or explain why they don't. So it's not an actual mandate, so it would be a disclosure, but it is certainly a step in the direction that California went. So I think that diversity is top of mind for shareholders. We know it's top of mind, at least in California. And I think, regardless of whether you're a board member of a company that's headquartered in California, I think given the shareholder sentiment associated with diversity, I think most public companies will be very focused on diversity. Again, it's trying to set the right tone at the top at the board level, but also in the C-suite and then beyond, including within the organization itself, given the importance of of diversity and the studies that indicate, how it correlates with improved performance and valuation. So that's a big issue, and I agree with you, that will be something that companies are focused on. In terms of the other things you've mentioned, human capital management, that's also obviously diversity, human capital management, they fall under the bigger umbrella of ESG that you mentioned. And human capital management is another area that shareholders are focused on. And most recently, the SEC actually implemented a new disclosure rule. And the disclosure rule will take effect this year for the first time, where companies will be asked to disclose in their 10K or in their proxy statement issues relative to their human capital measures or objectives. What are they doing to manage human capital within their business? And that, will include things like development, attraction, and retention of personnel. There's at least one source that has gone back and looked at the 2020 proxy statements to see how many companies were focused on disclosures concerning human capital in 2020. And interestingly, at least with respect to the largest companies, Fortune 100 companies, there has been a lot of disclosure about human capital. And I think we're going to continue to see a big focus on that. There's no question that the institutional investors are focused on human capital, and not just with respect to diversity, but there are also in terms of compensation, the equity relative to compensation, the well-being of employees. And obviously during COVID, there was some actual realistic issues for companies to face in that regard. Who should go to work? How do they get to work? What are the protocols when they go to work? So companies have been very, very focused on, employee issues in general. And now obviously we'll be looking at enhancing the disclosures concerning how they manage human capital in the context of this new rule. And then lastly, and then I'll pause, I was just going to say ESG in general, you know better than anybody that this has been a big mandate for institutional investors now for several years. We're seeing, some of the largest CEOs of some of the largest firms, whether it's BlackRock or State Street, the New York Controller, sending letters and being very, very explicit with boards and with companies about what their expectations are. And I think they're making it very clear that in their mind, long-term value is really impacted by things like how do you manage your human capital? How are you addressing climate change issues? And so, more and more, I think these other issues are translating to value. And so it's becoming a big issue for shareholders. And they're expecting companies not only to make disclosures about it, but also to wrap into their strategy and their business processes, controls and plans relative to how they're going to mitigate against some of the risks and enhance the company's performance over time by being prepared and addressing these potential issues. So I think those are things that boards, and there's also a chance, by the way, that we'll see more rulemaking particularly from the SEC on the ESG front, and particularly with respect to things like disclosure of, how are you dealing with climate change? How are you dealing with governance? We've seen a lot of disclosures over the last several years being enhanced relative to governance and why you're making the choices you're making. And I think the proxy statement or potentially standalone sustainability reports or whatever it is, but I think the board, has visibility into this because the compensation committee is obviously reviewing the proxy statement. The nominating committee is obviously focused on the proxy, at least as far as governance decisions are made. And I think if, boards should be mindful of the fact that those disclosures they make in all these regards are poured over by investors, and they're making judgments about not only about how they think the company will perform based on them, but also about whether they think the directors are spending enough time and making these issues a priority as they think they should be.
Well, I'm certainly happy for the progress in diversity. Somebody that's spent as much of their career working, on that for boardroom diversity, I'm happy. I will admit, though, I'm a little sad that it had to be done through, a law and through quotas, and that companies aren't recognizing this for the value that it brings. But at the same time, I suspect that if they don't respond in all of these issues that you've discussed, then they're going to find a way to do it through mandates and laws versus companies having the ability to do it themselves. So, I worry about that a little bit.
Well, and I do too, TK, honestly. And I agree with you. I mean, it's unfortunate that we ended up with quotas. I think the Rooney Rule is another way to get to diversity that a lot of people are talking about, a lot of organizations. I think even the New York Comptroller's Office has been pushing organizations to implement that. But I agree, when there's a delay in implementation, or companies aren't addressing these and adopting policies in the face of this input, you're right. We end up with regulations that become sort of everybody gets dragged along in the same regard. So I think it would be nice if boards were very attentive to these issues and were leading the effort.
Yeah, and I'm not sure anybody would say and that knows the NFL that the Rooney Rule has actually worked as well as they would have hoped that it would have worked. But Katie, we're running out of time, and there's an issue I really wanted to ask you about before we run out of time, and that's an issue that's been pushed aside in 2020 due to the pandemic and the social injustice, and that's cyber risk. And I just have this feeling that this is looming there as, what is going to be a hugely critical issue in 2021, and that, directors can't lose sight of that. But sort of give me your quick views on the legal aspects of that boards should be aware of.
Yeah, so this falls within the board oversight responsibility, and it's an important one because it's an area where, the question is, as a board member, have you done enough? Has the company done enough? We do know if there ends up being a problem, and of course, most recently we saw, SolarWinds, but some companies get, blindsided, or they're not anticipating these risks, and they get caught off guard. And I think that boards should continue to focus on their oversight responsibilities with respect to things like cybersecurity, because the fallout from a really terrible incident is can have a very negative effect on a company's business. And so, a board, there's a famous case called Caremark, which sort of established a relatively high bar for boards in terms of making sure that they oversee and ensure that the company is implementing proper controls and procedures to safeguard against what you would anticipate to be risks. It's also, that same case also made it clear that boards can't ignore red flags. They have to be paying attention to where there is potential risks, and that they help the company, oversee the company, implement policies, implement processes, et cetera, to reduce those risks. And in 2019, there was another case involving a ice cream company, Blue Bell Creamery, where they had a listeria breakout. And in the context of that, some people died, unfortunately. And the case survived a motion to dismiss. And I think the signal that it sent, to boards, was that perhaps the bar is coming down a little bit on these oversight matters, that boards need to, do a better job of anticipating risks and helping companies make sure that they safeguard against those risks. One of the other takeaways from that case was the lack of documentation in the board record, whether it was in the minutes or elsewhere, in terms of what the board was actually doing to oversee that particular issue. So what I would just say in terms of cyber risk this year is, given that it's always a looming risk out there for any company, and obviously companies are taking advantage of a lot of the technology and the resources available to them to mitigate the risk, it's very important that the board is clear on who's keeping track of it, who's getting regular updates, what is the management's expectation relative to the board's view on how this is being managed, making sure that you're devoting enough resources to the issue, and documenting the fact that you're doing all of this so that the company is well prepared, if anything did happen. Because, obviously, even with the best safeguards, you might still have a problem. But companies need to do what they can to put themselves in the best position. And actually, boards are in a fantastic position to do that because they can ask the obvious questions of, well, are we doing enough? Should we be talking to somebody else? And they also potentially bring perspectives, having being serving on other boards, interacting with other companies. They can also do a little bit of a comparison in their own minds. Are we doing enough? How does this compare with what I'm seeing in other companies? So I do think it's an area where a company does not want to let its guard down. They want to make sure that they are focused on it. And the last thing I would say is the SEC is also focused on this, and they're very focused on disclosure in particular. That companies are disclosing the fact that they're disclosing the fact that they have a risk, that they're disclosing timely any incidents. And even companies that haven't been the target, haven't been the subject of a particular target, are expected to be making disclosures. So I think again, disclosure and proper controls in this context are really important in terms of what the board's oversight responsibility is.
So, Katie, you and I in our careers have witnessed unbelievable change in the boardroom, okay, over the last 10 years, not counting 20 years.
Yep.
But I think this is really, we're seeing big changes in the boardroom, and these issues are going to be things that there'll be Delaware law, corporate law that sort of sets parameters on, what are expectations from directors. And it's going, all in all, I think it's going to be an interesting year. And I wanted to thank you for taking the time to sort of point us in that direction a little bit. And again, we'll be covering the other issues that relate to that or cases that come up that directors are in the crosshairs. And so we can offer good advice to everybody out there that's trying to be an effective director. So
Wonderful.
again, I want to thank you for your time.
My pleasure. It's always nice to see you, TK. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.